It's not very often that we get to see Rudeus act like this, but it's when we do that we get moments like this. These were all scenes that went above and beyond how they were portrayed in the novels. As it is with most episodes though, because the story focuses mainly on the perspective of Rudy, not much was given for the backstory of the Beast Girls he was torturing. So if you want to know more about them, why they're at this school and their reign of terror before Rudy, then stick around since that's what we're going to talk about here. That and the full extent of Rudeus's confinement of them. But first, today's video is sponsored by Tower of God New World, a pretty epic new 3D anime RPG based off the highly popular webtoon. No, seriously, seeing Tower of God come to life with this 3D cel-shaded style animation was actually pretty amazing considering it's free to play and on mobile. I honestly felt like I was watching the anime all over again, especially since the characters are voiced by all the same Japanese VAs from the anime. But not only does the game follow the story right from the beginning, it also adds to the universe with all these additional game-exclusive side stories. So regardless of whether you're familiar to the webtoon or completely brand new, anyone can enjoy the game and the high-quality animations put into all the visuals, gameplay, and cutscenes. As for the gameplay itself, well, it's more of an auto chess TFT experience focusing on team building and strategy. Every character has a color, class, and position, and each will either counter or supplement another character. You'll then put them into these 5-on-5 scenarios where the team with better synergy will usually win over the team with only SSRs. If you're more interested in all the characters though, then you'd be happy to know that we're right in the middle of the summer festival event. So if you've ever wondered what Yuri or Hwaryeon looks like in a swimsuit, then wonder no longer since that and more are unlockable now. You can also unlock pretty much every character that's ever been introduced in Tower of God. So if you want to experience this amazing story all over again, then I can't recommend enough using my link in the description to download it today. It's honestly been quite a bit of fun so far. Episode 31, The Kidnapping and Confinement of Beast Girls, covering chapters 7 and 8 from volume 8 of the light novel. Since last video I made the mistake of covering a side chapter I thought the anime would have skipped, from now on if there's ever something major like that again, I'll first preface the section with a spoiler alert. Luckily the spoilers this time were very minor, but I just wanted to apologize and make it clear that it's never my intent to spoil anything no matter how little it is. These videos will always only ever cover up to where the anime has reached in the novels. So I'm incredibly sorry if that last video ruined your experience for the next episode, and I promise I'll do my best to prevent that from happening in the future. But anyway, the whole intro with Sylphie missed quite a bit from what I talked about last video. There wasn't the mention of that Fitz lookalike sitting at Ariel's bedside, nor any exposition giving insight into Sylphie's relationship with Ariel. They didn't even go into what Sylphie thought her ideal relationship with Rudy would be like. So, if you're curious as to how Sylphie perceives both her relationships with Ariel and Rudy, then you should definitely go check out my last video. Moving on to after that, there was actually a whole section left out that gave backstory on both Linia and Pursena. It was a brief history on the beast folk, the Doldia, and how the two of them even ended up at university. I don't expect this to be covered later on, but since this is practically a subchapter in and of itself, here's a minor spoiler warning just in case. Okay. We already know Linia to be the granddaughter of Gustav and daughter of Gies, but what you may not know is that Pursena is not. While Linia is part of the Doldia, Pursena actually comes from the Adoldia. She's the granddaughter of the current leader Bulldog and daughter of the next in line Tertelia. Since both tribes are responsible for protecting the Great Forest though, their lineage is practically identical. They're both essentially princesses who will eventually take over as tribal leader. Now, the reason this is so important is because the Doldia have a responsibility tracing back to almost 5,500 years ago. It was in the aftermath of the first Great Human Demon War where the humans had just won and become quite arrogant because of it. With the beast folk living on land rich with lumber, it was only a matter of time until the humans would invade and try to make that resource their own. So, as numerous tribes and races faced imminent invasion, it was the beast god Geiger who would unite them and lead them. He was a renowned hero that came from the Doldia tribe, one revered as the leader of all beast folk. That being the case, it was even after Geiger had died that the responsibility of protecting the forest would pass on to the Doldia, a duty that's now been carried on for millennia. Nowadays, beast folk were expanding across the world, but with significant influence amongst the elves, dwarves, and hobbits, there was enough military power in the Great Forest alone to fight even Millis. In any case, the point is that Linia and Pursena are direct descendants of Geiger, two heirs just like how Gies and Ghislaine were themselves. As for why they were sent here, well, that's because Gies and Ghislaine were, well, stupid. They were a generation of descendants who turned out to be incredible screw-ups, mainly due to their lack of intelligence. So, in order to prevent that from happening a second time, Gustav ordered Linia and Pursena to go and study abroad. Perhaps by living in a place where their authority and position had zero meaning, they could come to learn exactly what it meant to have such a thing. But instead of discrimination like how the girls expected, what they received instead was flattery and caution. Flattery from students who were trying to humor them, and caution from teachers too timid to approach them. It was becoming rather apparent that their position as princesses still held weight here. So, what initially started out as them walking around in fear from just the mere sight of humans quickly turned into an ego that made them feel untouchable, especially when they found the unbeatable power of incanted magic combined with vocal magic. By using that with their already elite dexterity and strength, Linia and Pursena found that they could defeat pretty much anyone, eventually using it to extort, bully, and even blackmail. Then, after a year of doing exactly that, the two had made themselves into the bosses of their own delinquent faction, a group that would terrorize the halls and even claim parts of the school as their territory. What stopped them from taking over the entire school was the arrival of a certain princess from Asura. The teachers who were so eager to serve them were now rapidly flocking to this true princess from a more noble society. Initially, Linia and Pursena were willing to put up with it, but the more Ariel began to shine with her accomplishments, the more these two started to feel inferior to her. Their resentment only grew as Ariel received praise for being an honors student, then even more so when she joined the student council. When it got to the point where they couldn't take it anymore, that's when they would start to mess with her. First by bumping her shoulder or spitting on the floor next to her, but then by splashing her with water and even stealing her underwear. It was a continued escalation of harassment until Fitz would single-handedly put a stop to it. The plan itself was a trap set up by Ariel, but the showdown was fought and won by Fitz alone. She had defeated all 20 of Linia and Pursena's goons all by her lonesome, leading to their entire faction getting expelled because of it. The only reason Linia and Pursena weren't expelled with them was because once again their status had protected them. With no allies left and their social standing in the gutter though, the only place they could vent their rage was in the special classroom, a place where they would unfortunately take it out on Cliff and Xanaba. Aside from that though, there were no moves made towards revenge, and the two were actually attending class in earnest now. It would be a fair statement to say that they were perhaps rehabilitated. Thus the reason why Linia declared themselves model students during their encounter with RUDEUS. Now, switching to the actual content of the episode, when we get to the opening scenes with Julie, this whole training montage was supposed to be given from the perspective of Xanaba. He would think to himself just how peculiar RUDEUS' training methods were, then stare in awe as the results became apparent only a single month later. It was an impressive accomplishment that reassured him of why he'd chosen Rudy as his master. As for his thoughts on Julie, well, he was quite surprised by just how intuitive she was. Not only was she learning the native tongue rather quickly, but she also seemed to understand his orders even if she didn't know all the exact words of them. There were numerous times where she was able to do things correctly both on the first time and without further instruction. Something Xanaba wanted to make sure Julie understood though was just how important it was to value the craft that she was going to be mastering. You see, if she lacked passion for the very art she would be making, then Xanaba knew the whole endeavor would be pointless. If she was gonna make figures the way that he wanted, then he wanted to make sure that she truly understood the magnificence of them. That was the only way to make her shine. When it came to Rudy's inquiry and subsequent revelation next, this would be the first time in which Xanaba would truly see his master angry. Before, he'd only ever seen him respond with dispassionate politeness or self-deprecating deference, but here Rudy's murderous intent was palpable. No longer was he speaking in his usual carefully modulated tones, but was instead tripping over his words as he showcased his profuse fanaticism. Personally, Xanaba didn't care too much for Roxy as a person, but if he was to declare that now in the heat of the moment, then Rudy was sure to murder him without remorse. It didn't matter if he was a blessed child or not, because no amount of supernatural strength was enough to endure the level of magic Rudy would unleash on him. Even his body wasn't that resistant to it. So, with no choice but to tell the truth, that's when we were given the explanation for it all. Linia and Pursena had challenged him to a duel, and it was after he lost that the price was Roxy. What the anime doesn't tell us is just how confident Zeniba was going into it. You see, as a blessed child who'd never once been defeated in Shirone, Zeniba had no doubt that he would be able to win against these two. Even if they used anything in the advanced tier or below, he would just grit his teeth and run straight through it. The last thing Zeniba expected, though, was that a strange magic would paralyze him in place, then render him defenseless, leaving him open against a barrage of attacks that would ultimately defeat him. So it was once Rudy had heard that this was the way things played out that his murderous intent would subside for something even more sinister. It was an expression that showed just how important figurines were to him. Initially, his lack of passion made Zeniba think he didn't love them all that much, but after seeing his reaction now, it was clear Rudy's feelings for them were far more fierce than anyone's. So much so that Zeniba was certain Linia and Pursena were going to die that day. At first, Zeniba was afraid of what he'd just started, but after realizing the powerful ally that was now at his side, that fear quickly turned to joy knowing revenge was right around the corner. Switching back to Rudy's perspective now, if there was one thing he hated most, it was bullying. Had they stuck to just barking orders, then maybe he could have let that slide since Fitz's intervention had put them in their place already. But it was the desecration of Roxy herself that made him understand why religious incursions happened all throughout history. To him, such a sin was absolutely unforgivable. So, as he planned his method of attack, his experience as an adventurer led him to approach it all calm and collected-like. He wasn't about to overestimate his abilities and end up losing just like how Zeniba did. No, since they had defeated a blessed child 2-on-1, Rudy knew that they were likely very formidable, much to the point that it was safest to consider them as strong as Eris. Now, despite not knowing exactly how strong they were, what he did know was exactly how they were going to attack. One will rapidly charge and use magic to confuse the opponent, while the other would stay behind and immobilize the enemy with vocal magic. They were complementary roles that were also interchangeable between the two of them. It was as Rudy contemplated the best way to confront this that Zeniba would insist such preparations were unnecessary. I mean, to him his master was all-powerful and unassailable. A notion Rudy felt needed correcting since to his knowledge there were at least 4 people stronger than him. The very thought was an immense shock to Zeniba, but with those being only the ones Rudy knew, it was very possible both Linia and Pursena could be part of that list as well. Besides, Rudy just wanted this victory to be absolute and flawless, so much so that he was actually willing to recruit both Fitz and Elise to fight as well. Since both seemed busy though, a 2-on-2 was the only option available. It was a fight Zeniba wanted to initiate through the proper dueling customs of either Shirone or the Doldia tribe, but was instead disregarded for an ambush since this fight was the farthest thing from a duel. For Rudy it was a bona fide holy war. Now, because the beast folk's senses would reveal any and all surprise attacks, Rudy instead decided to just ambush them. He would scout their path to and from classes, then wait in the optimal position to intercept them. He expected them to skip out on class early, but because Linia and Pursena were actually taking them seriously now, Rudy and Zeniba were left standing here for the entire duration. Likely an hour or two of literally standing exactly how they were here. When we get to the actual fight, there isn't really too much to add other than Rudy wanting to negate Pursena's vocal magic with his disturb magic. Ideally that would have been the optimal move to counter her, but because he had no idea how that magic worked or even how the mana behind it flowed, he wasn't certain disturb magic would even work here. His demon eye was certainly helpful for dealing with Linia, but with movements as sloppy as hers, a handicap like that wasn't even necessary. Her attack was a stark contrast from what he would have expected if dealing with Eris. She would have charged straight towards him, never even let herself get hit by his counter, then in the off chance that she did get knocked down, she would have grabbed his leg here and snapped his tibia. Of course, Rudy would have responded differently as well, but the point was that far more skilled fighters would have lasted longer. Sure, Eris does have experience fighting Rudy personally, but someone like Paul was able to counter his Quagmire instantly, even after having never seen it before. So, either Linia and Pursena were actually quite weak, or Paul and Eris were actually incredibly strong. He wasn't sure considering all the extremely powerful people he'd fought up until now. In any case, the whole captivity scene after this was pretty much as we saw. There was a bit of additional back and forth between Linia and Pursena, but the only thing worth noting was their recount of how Zeniba stayed late into the night trying to collect every shattered piece of the Roxy figure. It didn't matter how small it was because Zeniba wasn't going to leave behind even a single fragment. It was an act of respect that filled Rudy's heart with affection for him. This, combined with the fact that the figure was easily fixable, had subsided his rage just a little bit, but not enough to let them go since they didn't quite seem remorseful enough. Sure, they were apologetic for desecrating someone's god, but they didn't seem the same for destroying another person's precious property. Enough that if Rudy was to let them go now, he was certain they would just end up doing it again one day. So, in order to prevent that from happening, Rudy would ask Zeniba what he thought a fitting punishment was. Initially, he wanted to smash them the same way they did to Roxy, but since killing them was definitely out of the question, he instead settled on selling them as slaves to the Asura Kingdom. He'd heard they had an intense love for beast folk there and was content with breaking an international treaty to do so. Sure, the very act would likely start a war between Shirane and the beast folk, but to Zeniba that was a small price to pay if it meant getting his revenge. He had zero consideration for self-preservation, unlike how Rudy did. So, with those not being very practical, the only other option was to ask Fitz, leading to that whole discussion in the library. This wasn't shown in the anime, but the way Rudy had justified his actions was by saying he was friends with the tribal chief. It was a segue into the whole story about how he'd ended up befriending them. Yet another tale showcasing just how amazing he was to her. Now, if you're wondering why Linia and Pursena ended up the way that they did here, well, in addition to the hunger which had become unbearable, their enhanced senses made being trapped in a dorm filled with men absolute torture. Reason being that the intent of those around them was so incredibly potent that every footstep they heard had made them fear it was the end of them. So it wasn't just a lack of sustenance that made them fold, but also a constant state of fear lasting almost 24 hours. It was more than enough time to convince them to become Rudy's followers. In case they did start to rebel again though, the paint Fitz applied read that they were a dog and cat who had lost to Rudeus. They only had to keep that for a single day, but the paint on their backs would have to stay for a little bit longer. There were several embarrassing statements Fitz wrote which she mentioned would remain for 6 months, kind of like an extra layer of caution for them. But yeah, that was pretty much it for the episode. Now, before I go, I just want to thank Tower of God New World once again for sponsoring this video. If you want to experience this amazing story in a more interactive and immersive manner, then I highly recommend using my link in the description to download it today. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time.